Let's talk some college football. The national director recruiting for ESPN, also a college football analyst for ESPN, joins us right now to talk some football. Tom Luginbill joins us here on the new Sentinel Sports page. Hey, Tom, Vince, and Jesse Smithey. Good morning, Tom. How are you?
I'm doing good. Good morning to you guys.
Morning. And first, before we get into some recruiting and your thoughts on college football playoff, a lot to get to. First, I want to get your thoughts on the two new teams that officially came into the Southeastern Conference this weekend. Just if you could, one by one, a summary thought on the two new schools coming in, Texas A&M and Missouri. Your thoughts on them coming into the conference from a football standpoint and how you think they'll adjust to the league.
Well, I think that if you look at the two teams coming in my opinion, Texas A&M has a few more advantages than Missouri does. They've got more resources. They've got more money. They've got higher-end facilities, and they've got a grander recruiting pool. I think there will be more challenges for Missouri for those very reasons. I think they're going to have to sink a lot of money into the program to upgrade their facilities. I think they're going to have to really broaden their recruiting net because, unfortunately, for Missouri, they've spent so much time in the state of Texas recruiting to compete in the Big 12 because, Missouri and their surrounding states, that's not a very talented or deep pool. So I think what you're going to see Missouri do is continue in Texas, but they've also got to dip down into SEC territory and create a presence. It's going to be very interesting, in my opinion, to see how both of these teams in the early going play on the road. Do they got to go between the hedges? Do they got to go down into the swamp? Who's got to go into Death Valley for an early night game? Those things are going to be very fun to watch because I think those environments, and I've been in college football landscapes from the Pac-12 to the Big 10 to the Big 12 and certainly to the SEC. The SEC road environments, in my opinion, are superior to others, and I think it's going to be a very, very difficult challenge for teams with their travel and being in a foreign environment to see who has the maturity and the team chemistry and the coaching staff that knows how to handle that element and have their team ready to play.
With what Texas A&M and Missouri do, who has the bigger adjustment, those two schools to the SEC or the SEC to those two schools?
I think those two schools to the SEC, without question, and it all starts up front. And I think that both of those teams are going to find that out, particularly Missouri. I think Missouri, as innovative as they've been on offense and as prolific as they've been, they haven't been deemed to be a physical, get-after-you up-front type of football team. And I think that's going to be an adjustment for them. I think it's going to be an adjustment to some degree for Texas A&M, probably more so now under Kevin Sumlin with what his offensive approach is going to be than it would have been, say, under Mike Sherman, who's a little bit more multiple, a little bit more of a run-first mentality. I think it's going to be very interesting to see how both teams hold up front. I think that will determine the fate. I think it will challenge their depth, and you'll find out in week 9, 10, 11 just how strong those teams are in their roster as a whole when they start getting dinged up, particularly on their offensive and defensive lines.
As far as what these two schools bring to the conference from the fan standpoint, you look at Texas A&M and for, schools in the SEC, fan bases, well, that's kind of intriguing. They have a lot of tradition. It'd be a kind of a fun place to go. That's a must-watch game. But somewhere down the line, do you think Missouri will fall into one of those type of same breaths as say, a Vanderbilt, where you just kind of skip that road trip? You don't really feel like going up there to see that game?
You know what? I would hope not, because I know, under Gary Pinkel, they've had some contests there. And a few years back when they were in the top 5 at one point during the season, they host Nebraska for a night game, or you get a ranked opponent there night. And Columbia can turn into a pretty rowdy and wild place. And I would hope at least in the early going, these fan bases want to experience something new. They want to kind of get a sense for a new road environment. And, everybody's heard of, the 12th man at College Station and what a daunting environment that is. But I don't think people are as familiar with Missouri, so I hope they would take that into account and at least spend the time to see what that environment has to offer.
We're visiting with ESPN college football analyst and national director of recruiting, Tom Luginbill, here on the new Sentinel Sports page. Tom, give me your thoughts on the 4-team college playoff that has been created.
I like it. I believe it's a step in the right direction. The one thing I pointed out last week when we were on air on ESPNU is what I don't quite understand in this entire scenario is why there is such a dramatic need for this new approach in this new committee. And hear me out for a second here, but when you really think about it, I don't think that people or fans or detractors from the BCS model as it stands right now are so upset with the process by which they get to the end result. I think they're more upset with the fact that they don't understand it. There is a lack of transparency. But the reality is, and people may not want to hear this, but for the most part, the BCS has gotten it right. They've gotten the best two teams, and that's all they were required to do. So my take on this is, if the process, which has more objectivity due to the computers in the current model than it will have going forward in 2 years with more of a subjective model, why wouldn't you just take the current process you have right now and just expand it to the 4 teams? If you took the last, let's just say 10 years, or go back to 2006 when they added the BCS championship game, and just take the top 5 finishes before the bowl games of the BCS rankings, draw a line under team number 4, and I've done it. When you go look at it, they didn't get it wrong. You would have had the 4 teams. If you would have done this last year, all those proponents for Oklahoma State playing, well, Oklahoma State would have had their chance. They finished in the top 4. And so I'm a little bit put off that there seems to be such a huge need for changing how we get to those 4 teams. I think if you kept it the way it is right now, you probably wouldn't be far off, because you'd have a little bit more objectivity, and I think you'd eliminate some biases that are sure to come into play with the more human elements that come into play.
So how can you make that committee objective? And I brought this up on the show before and discussed it with Vince. Do you bring in some college football writers to balance out who's on the committee already?
I don't know if there's a true way of eliminating biases and relationships regardless of who's on the committee. I think my concern lies more with what are the credentials and the qualifications for the people on this committee that will be making these judgments. And I always equate it to a university who's building a medical wing. Well, they're not going to go get the football coach to put them on the board to decide who the best doctors are to go hire. They're going to go get professionals in that profession to make those determinations, and I would hope that will be the case here. I understand that, writers cover it and things of that nature, but the writers and those in the media that haven't had to earn a living in the profession, haven't had to have that record go next to their name, they don't truly know the ins and outs of how things operate the way coaches do. I'd really like to see this be a football-heavy committee with people who have had to live that lifestyle, make a living with that record going next to their name. I think that would give you the most credibility. You're going to have biases. There's going to be relationships. You're not going to be able to avoid it. But at least I would have more confidence in the people on the panel making the decisions based off of what their experiences are and what they know.
Tom, before we get into some recruiting topics with you, we see a lot of the preseason polls coming out. Are there any teams that you think are being overvalued, some teams being undervalued, and who are some of your teams to look for in 2012?
Well, I think what's going to be very interesting is, as you do look at rankings and kind of what's come out so far, is who's going to be the Cinderella? We don't, for the first time in 5 years, we don't have an automatic Boise right now. We don't have that team that everybody says, is this going to be their year? I think Boise's they're going to be rebuilding quite a bit. I do believe that this is a year where, depending on health, you could see some teams make a jump and become far more competitive. I think if Tennessee stays healthy, I still question their depth, but if they stay healthy, they're going to have some offensive firepower that could really help them make some waves. I look at Florida State. There was so much hype about the Seminoles last year, which I did not think was warranted after I'd gone in there and watched them in the spring. But I do think this year they might have a chance to legitimize that hype as far as being a preseason contender. I don't think there's any question in my mind. And then, everybody's talking about USC. I only have one question about USC, and that is, do they have the depth without a significant drop in talent from one guy to the next to run the gamut to 13 weeks if they get injured? That's my question, because the schedule should allow for them to flourish. But if they get banged up, it's not going to be as easy for them as everybody thinks it is. I know they got a great one under center. There's a lot of teams coming back with good quarterbacks. Oklahoma, obviously, Landry Jones decides to come back. So I think it's going to be a lot of fun to see who a dark horse is. Who's going to be the Cinderella this year? That's going to be fun for me to watch.